Good evening. I'm Professor Naomi Sokolov of the Jewish Studies program and the Near East Department here at the University of Washington. It's my privilege to welcome you to the second lecture in the Stroum Lecture series for the year 2001, and it's my honor to introduce our speaker, Professor Paul Mendes-Flohr. This year's topic is post-traditional Jewish identities. On Monday evening, Professor Mendes-Flohr opened his discussion with a talk called Cultural Disjunctions and Modern Jewish Identity. As he considered some of the complex issues of identity that Jews face in the modern world, he observed that identity is never fixed and static, but rather multiply layered, ever-shifting, and evolving over time. His own professional identity is certainly multifaceted, and over the years, his work has illuminated multiple aspects of Jewish identity. Among his professional roles, he is professor of Jewish thought at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, director of the Franz Rosenzweig Center for German Jewish Literature and Cultural History, and a faculty member of the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. His research has covered modern Jewish thought, German Jewish intellectual history, the writings of Rabbi Nachman, Zionism and Jewish political thought, Jewish-Christian theological encounter, and much more. As editor, essayist, and author, Paul Mendes-Flohr has been our most profound interpreter of the cultural work that gained expression in the great renaissance of Jewish life and learning in Germany between the world wars, and that gained its definitive and lasting legacy in the works of Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig. His many books include such titles as The Jew in the Modern World, A Documentary History, German Jews, A Dual Identity, From Mysticism to Dialogue, Martin Buber and the Transformation of German Social Thought, and A Land of Two Peoples, Martin Buber and the Arabs. The title of tonight's talk is Jewish Cultural Memory, Its Multiple Configurations. Please join me in welcoming Professor Paul Mendes-Flohr.
And good evening. I concluded the last lecture with a poem from Walt Whitman, and I'd like to read another section of that, another passage of that poem in order to evoke the theme. It's from a poem called Song of Myself. I am of old and young, of the foolish as much as the wise, regardless of others, ever regardful of others. Maternal as well as paternal, a child as well as a man, stuffed with the stuff that is coarse and stuffed with the stuff that is fine. One of the great nations, the nation of many nations, the smallest the same and the largest the same. A southerner, soon as a northerner, a planter, nonchalant and hospitable. A Yankee bound by my own way, ready for trade, my joints, the limber joints of earth and the sternest joints on earth. A Kentuckian walking the vale of the einkorn in my deerskin leggings, a boatman over the lakes or bays or along coasts. Louisianan, a Georgian, a poke easy from sandless and pines, at home on the Canadian snowshoes, or up in the bush, or with fishermen off Newfoundland, at home on the hills of Vermont, or in the woods of Maine, or the Texas ranch. The comrade of Californians, comrades, and this is the line I really reason this for, I'll repeat. Comrade of Californians, comrade of the free Northwesterners, loving their big proportions. Comrade of raftsmen and coalmen, comrade of all who shake hands and welcome to drink and meet, a learner with the simplest, a teacher of the thoughtfulest, of every hue and trade and rank, of every caste and religion, not merely of the New World, but of Africa, Europe, or Asia, a wandering savage, a farmer, mechanic, or artist, a gentleman, sailor, lover, or Quaker, a prisoner, fancy man, rowdy, lawyer, physician, or priest. I resist everything, better than my own diversity. And of course, in our previous lecture, we spoke of diversity, and as Naomi very well and eloquently put it, my theme was to describe or to explore the diverse, fluid identities that Jews share with other denizens of the modern world. Just to illustrate how Jews in particular have internalized the ethos of this diversity, I'd like to take you back through an anecdote to the old country, that is Brooklyn. And when I was a kid, they would say that, or tell of a story of a gentleman who was hungry and came across a Chinese restaurant and looked at the menu, and to check the prices, of course. And as he peered into the restaurant, he noticed a Chinese waiter. A black waiter. He said, a black waiter in a Chinese restaurant? Can't be. Even though it was a bit pricey, he said, well, I'll go in anyway. Curiosity overcame his frugality. And he went in and wanted to strike up a conversation with this black waiter in a Chinese restaurant. So he said, sir, can you recommend something? So the waiter said, yes, pizza. He said, wait a minute, a Chinese restaurant, no offense, but a black waiter suggesting pizza? So the black waiter said, well, man, this is a Jewish neighborhood. And there's another story. Someone asked me to say something about Yiddish. You'll remember that. In Ratner's kosher restaurant in Lower East Side, New York City. Again, the gentleman goes into the restaurant and there's a black waiter who speaks fluent Yiddish. So he goes up to the boss, the customer, and says, "Ich red Yiddish." He speaks Yiddish. Shh, he thinks he's learning English. I don't know what this says about the Jewish cosmopolitan spirit, but nonetheless, if you'll allow me to continue with my lecture. Jewish cultural memory, its manifold configurations. And of course, as I proceed, I'll be defining Jewish cultural memory as I understand it. Were we to cast anew Greek mythology, the god of manifold identities, which we characterized in the previous lecture as the signature of the modern self, would be Protesius, the son of Poseidon, the god of the seas. Protesius was reputed to be the source of supreme knowledge, or the supreme source of knowledge, past, present, and future. From afar and near, many would come to seek his sapient counsel, but he was reluctant to divulge what he knew. When approached, Protesius would elude his importunate interlocutors by changing his form. Now he was a lion, now a serpent, a leopard, a boar, a tree, fire, water. Proteus would change his shape and external identity, Homer tells us, much as the ever-changing seas, which together with his siblings and father, he guarded. But Protesius was no chameleon such as Woody Allen's Selig, whom we discussed in the previous lecture. His sense of self remained firm. His shifting external identities were mere strategies of dissimulation meant to protect the integrity of the wisdom with which he was blessed. In contrast, in changing his identity with the ease and celerity, speed of a chameleon, Alan Zelig has no self. His swiftly changing identities mask, at best, a withered self, shriveled by his desperate attempts to pass. In contrast, Protesius hides, or rather protects himself behind the identity mask he devises to fend off what he regarded to be a hostile, intrusive world. Here our parable breaks down. We have argued that protein, a word of course derived from Proteus, ever-changing identities, is a source of self-knowledge and moral depth. As such, our multiple identities ennobles human dignity. But it's precisely in order to secure the epistemological and moral dignity of the various identities we bear that the tale of Proteus takes on added, albeit paradoxical, significance. As Homer relates, Proteus's shifting identities often followed the frenetic, unpredictable rhythms of the sea. And hence, Proteus serves to alert us to the danger that multiple identities might also lead to a schizoid frenzy of persona that threatens the integrity of those identities. I trust you hear me. Does we overcome the problem? Yes. Okay. The frenzy multiplication of identities might also threaten the stability of the self. Here it is important to note that although conterminous, overlapping, the self and identity are not to be regarded as terminological synonyms. The self is the biographical and psychological center of an individual, whereas identity is a cultural, social, and political construct that enables the self to place his or her story in the context of a community and its narrative. Accordingly, one may have a weak sense of self and correspondingly a strong sense of social and communal identity, and vice versa. Indeed, the self and identity may be in tension. Proteus's recurrent attempts to evade his interlocutors, those who came to ask him of his wisdom, by donning different identities suggests such a tension. To be sure of a self cannot be facilely abstracted from one's primordial, historical, and cultural identity, as the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre reminds us, affirming what he holds to be the incontrovertible need for the self to be anchored in an identity. MacIntyre observes, and I quote, "The story of myself is always embedded in the story of those communities from which I derive my identity, that is, my social, political, cultural, and historical identity. I am born with a past, and to try to cut myself off from that past is to deform my present relationships. The possession of an historical identity and the possession of a social identity coincide." End of quote. The self is born into a community which provides it with a social identity, initially through its family, and in quick succession, a linguistic, cultural, religious, social, and political identity. We do not choose our primordial identities, although to be sure, we may in time come to modify and add to those identities. Indeed, that is the very heart of the problematic I am exploring in these lectures. To illustrate this problematic as it appertains to the Jews of modernity, I should like to make a quick historical and sociological excursus. In doing so, I will argue that the liberation of the Jews from the ghettos of Europe may have enhanced the individual Jew's sense of self with the serving of individual opportunity, of economic and professional advancement, but frequently at the price of a weakened Jewish identity. Rather than simply seeing this process as one of assimilation with an attendant loss of Jewish literacy and identity, I should like to nuance our understanding of this process by viewing the Jews' passage into the modern world as taking place under the patronage of Proteus, the god of multiple identities, and to argue that the Jews' adoption of the cultural and social identities of others need not vitiate, weaken their attachment to their primordial community and its cultural universe, although this has often been the case. The late Bishop Kenneth Cragg, an eminent and sympathetic student of Islam, observed that one should study religions as a complex of distinctive but ultimately overlapping phenomena, alluding to the 3 R's of education: reading, writing, arithmetic. That's the way you say it, reading, writing, arithmetic. He spoke of the three C's of religion: creed, cult, community. With respect to traditional Judaism, I would add some C's. In addition to creed, cult, and community, one may also speak of code, C-O-D-E, namely the halakha, the religious law governing the life of the Jew, and the covenant, the brit. And of course, the sign of the covenant for its male members is circumcision, brit milah. And beyond the religious components constitutive of Judaism, we have the C's of cuisine and comedy. One should not downplay the significance of the latter C's, cuisine and comedy. Long after he converted to Christianity, for instance, the poet Heinrich Heine waxed eloquently about his nostalgia for Jewish cooking and humor. And I provided slides so we just can see what I'm referring to. So creed refers to the anim amin, the belief system that constitutes Judaism, because there is one God who created the world, and a world that is regarded to be good indeed, tov ma'od, very good. And we have elements of Jewish creed that we're all familiar with. Second would be cult, the way you worship. And the code would be the halakha. And then, of course, the other C, community, which perhaps can be summarized by the concept of covenant, the brit. As we enter the modern world, of course, these C's often are under stress. Creed becomes problematic for many. Some hold on to the cult despite the weakening of creed. The code, the halakha, is often the victim of the strains placed by the modern world on the creed. But a sense of community proves to be most enduring, as I'll examine later with you. And the notion of covenant, that Israel as a community is beholden to something larger than themselves, transcendent God, and the task God imposes upon the Jewish people. All that begins to, of course, get blurred and confused as we enter the modern world through the process we call secularization, and what I'm exploring on the multiplication of our identities and attachments, affiliations. The world of our imagination and emotion, sensitivity, now, of course, becomes more complex, not only anchored in these three C's. Humorously, but not utterly in vain, I've marked circumcision, obviously another C. Just to play with the C's, you probably can add some for me. Comedy, Jewish humor, and Jewish cuisine, of course. Here I have a reversed image of the C. That's because it's a Hebrew letter, Klal Yisrael. It just occurred to me that might fit in as well. Klal Yisrael, of course, means the community of Israel. And I'll be introducing another C as I proceed, cultural memory. So as we proceed, we can discuss this later on if you like. With their exit from the ghettos of Europe, or rather entrance into the modern world, sponsored by their emancipation, the Jews' allegiance to these C's began to totter. New, essentially indeed aggressively secular ways of thinking about the world often led to the eclipse of the creed informing traditional Judaism. As a consequence, fidelity to the cult, the religious practices enjoined by the Torah as the Word of God, began to weaken. The comprehensive religious code governing the interpersonal and communal life of the Jew was similarly compromised. A sense of community proved more enduring, although for ever-increasing number of Jews, that sense of community was no longer understood as marked and ruled by a covenant. And the sense of Jewish community also began to attenuate as Jews bonded with other communities and cultural universes. The process commenced in the late 18th century. This process of weakening the C's, their disentanglement, if you wish. And it's important to realize that the C's overlap, obviously, in a traditional Jewish life. This is simply an analytical distinction. The process of the disentangling, weakening of some seas, the changing of the valence of other seas at the expense of the others. This process commenced in the late 18th century, Central and Western Europe, which hosted relatively small Jewish populations. The greater part of the Jewish world, or Jewish population, in 1880, an estimated 75% of all Jews then resided in Eastern Europe, which lagged behind the rest of Europe in the march towards political and economic modernity. There, the forces of Enlightenment and liberalism, which promoted the emancipation of Central and West European Jewry, were endorsed but in a sporadic and half-hearted manner, and thus hardly affected the sad lot of East European Jewry. Ironically, it was rather the forces of reaction that thrust the Jews of Eastern Europe into the modern world. In the 1880s, a ferocious wave of pogroms broke out in Tsarist Russia, which at the time, of course, included what we now call Poland and other sectors of East European society. And in the wake of these pogroms, a frightened Jewry began to flee, launching the great migration of millions of Jews. Russian Jews were soon joined by Polish, Romanian, Hungarian, Galician, and Baltic Jews in quest of what one had hoped would be safe havens in the West. The figures are well known. By 1914, nearly 3 million Jews left East Europe, perhaps 75% finding refuge in the Americas, which of course includes the United States of America and our Canadian neighbors. In all, as much as 1/3, perhaps more, of East European Jewry fled to the West. The cultural and social consequences of this massive migration was, I shouldn't say this word here, but seismic. Just to illustrate these figures, I have more transparencies. This is a table which gives us the geographic distribution of world Jewry. You'll notice that in 1880, 75% of the Jews of the world resided in Eastern Europe. And at that time, only in the Western Europe, 13.5 means Germany, France, and Italy, etc. And 3.5% of world Jewry resided in the United States. By 1939, still a very sizable Jewish community resided in Eastern Europe, but it was down to 45%, and the rest of Europe was 11%, and the United States already 33%. One way of visualizing what happens is you take a fist, and the fist is the great concentration of Jews in Eastern Europe, and with the pogroms, suddenly the Jews spread out. This index finger being, of course, the United States, some to other parts of Europe, England, some even to the Scandinavian countries, and some to South America, Central America, South America. There's a great dispersion, literally, of the Jews. So, and with the dispersion, you'll see there's another type of dispersion that takes place. But a few more of these transparencies. This is a table of Jewish migrations from 1885 to 1930. From Russia to the United States, of course, almost 2 million Jews have arrived. In Canada, 70,000, etc. Huge numbers of Jews are on the move. The emergence of non-European Jewish centers. The table is meant to indicate that suddenly the new centers of Jewish life emerge as a result of this fragmentation of the mass of Jewish settlement in Eastern Europe. Of course, the great new center is the United States and Canada, but you have significant communities in South America and elsewhere. So now I've done my pedagogic bit. I'll bore you again with my reading. The Jews, and I'll try to explain the significance of this process. The Jews of Eastern Europe had lived in huge demographic concentrations. That is before this process took place, and even after it, obviously. which allowed them to maintain a large degree of cultural and linguistic autonomy. A census conducted by the Tsarist authorities in the late 1890s revealed that over 95% of the Jewish population spoke Yiddish as their mother tongue. Knowledge of Hebrew, both as a sacred tongue and increasingly as a vehicle of secular expression, was also widespread. Correspondingly, there was a vibrant and varied Jewish cultural life conducted in Yiddish and Hebrew. This meant that in the late 19th century, 75% of the Jewish people, and if we factor in the Jews of the Near East, who at the time constituted just under 10% of world Jewry, the figure would be 85%. This large number of Jews still lived a distinctively Jewish way of life. The massive migration meant the demographic dispersion of the Jews into many different countries of the West. Remember my fist and the fingers stretching out. Where, in this dispersion, where the cultural and linguistic integrity of the Jews would soon be undermined. Although initially they gathered in their new homes, London, Buenos Aires, New York City, Seattle. That's not the original text, but to be nice. They gathered in tight communities where they maintained a semblance of the cultural and linguistic life they brought with them. Within a generation, the prevailing sociological and political realities would leave their mark. Jews now adopted many different languages as their mother tongue, with a corresponding loss of knowledge of Yiddish and Hebrew, and thus ready access to the literature that was the principal font, wellspring of what we will presently define as the cultural memory of Judaism. The overarching significance of this development, as the Zionist thinker Ahad Ha'am observed in near Cassandran terms, was the fracturing of the cultural unity of the Jewish people and the unraveling of the fabric of the shared symbolic and imaginative universe that sustained the Jews throughout the millennia. He regarded the resulting cultural fragmentation to be the most urgent problem facing the Jewish people, more pressing indeed than assimilation. His proffered or suggested solution is well known and need not detain us here, other than to note that he held that the reconstitution of the cultural unity of the Jewish people would require a radical accommodation of Judaism to the modern secular and humanist sensibilities. He and his colleagues in the Zionist movement, among them Aleph Dalet Gordon, Bialik, and Martin Buber, made many suggestions how this was to be achieved. But they were confronted by seemingly intractable contradictions, consequent to the attempt to translate fundamentally religious categories and values into secular terms. Contradictions, if I may make an all too facile observation, Zionism, that is, Israeli culture, has yet to resolve. Here it will suffice to note a grand paradox of the Jewish experience of modernity. Although Jews have on the whole fared exceptionally well in the modern world, and indeed have made seminal contributions to the shaping of the cultural and social economic institutions of modernity, their participation in the new order was not prepared by an imminent process within Judaism itself. As my Jerusalem colleague Zvi Wróblewski somewhat whimsically put it, and I quote, "Jewry did not enter modern European society in a long process of endogenous gestation and growth, but they plunged into it as the ghetto walls were being breached with a bang, though not without prolonged whimpers. To be sure, there are various ideologies, liberal, reform, conservative, neo-Orthodox, religious Zionism, that seek to adjust Judaism theologically and culturally to modernity. No matter how we may assess these religious adjustments to modernity, they do not belie the fact that the modern world is not a product of Judaism, although some anti-Semites, such as Werner Sombart, have argued otherwise, insisting that the modern world is a curse spun from the womb of Judaism. No serious scholar, however, has traced the origins of the founding attitudes and values of modern economic and political order, of the modern economic and political order to Judaism, such as Max Weber had demonstrated with respect to certain developments in Protestantism as a source of the spirit of capitalism. Although the attitudes and values nurturing the modern ethos did not emerge from within Judaism, one may ask whether or not Judaism, as a distinct system of religious knowledge and value, nonetheless found a home in the modern world. Wroblewski's quip that Jewry left the ghetto, that is, the realm of where Jewish tradition reigns supreme, with a bang, but not without prolonged whimpers, implicitly suggests not. The whimpers he hears express a certain sense of dislocation, a festering unease that raises the phenomenological and theological question whether Judaism, in fact, finds itself, or at least should find itself, in tension with the metaphysical and axiological, the value systems that inform the modern world. I shall return to this issue in my third lecture, where I shall consider it from the perspective of the post-traditional Jewish realities I have just enumerated. Clearly, post-traditional Jewry finds itself, for better or worse, in the modern world. It is a Jewry for whom the C's, the creed, code, cult, community, and covenant, that have provided the cement of Jewish identity and have furnished it with a cognitive coherence, confessional conviction, a cultural consistency, and communal cohesiveness are no longer self-evident. And I want you to know I made great effort to maintain the alliteration. This note, I'm very proud of that. It took time. It was like a Scrabble puzzle, right? Like cement, coherence, cognitive certainty, confessional conviction, cultural consistency, communal cohesion. I'm proud. I'm glad it's on television. Post-traditional Jews live without the protective insularity of a tradition grounded in a bounded cultural and linguistic space that ensure the continuity of Jewish identity in the past. Post-traditional Jews belong to residential, professional, recreational communities that are no longer contiguous, not to say identical with one another, with their ethnic and religious community. Unlike their ancestors of the old country, whether in Europe, or the Near East, or Brooklyn, post-traditional Jews no longer live, play, and work strictly with their fellow Jews. Post-traditional Jews have read Spinoza, Voltaire, Kant, Marx, Hegel, Darwin, Freud, Foucault, Wittgenstein, and hence no longer reads, or rather can no longer read, the text of the tradition without the critical insights of these and other savants. Post-traditional Jews share not only the critical intellectual reflexes of their fellow moderns, but also read the same books and newspapers, view the same TV programs, attend the same concerts and theater performances as do their non-Jewish neighbors. In short, post-traditional Jews do not occupy a cultural space restricted to the Jews alone, or restricted to Judaism alone. As I've argued in the first lecture, post-traditional Jews have multiple social and cultural identities that engage their passion and imagination. To be sure, one should not forget that the modern world has also wrought diabolical forces that have sought to keep the Jews socially and politically apart. But rarely have they succeeded in alienating the Jews from their new cultural universe. The Jews' devotion to that universe was particularly manifest during the Third Reich, when the Nazis fiendishly rescinded the emancipation and pushed the Jews back into the ghetto. Resisting spiritual degradation, the disinherited Jews of Europe affirmed their humanity through an abiding and defiant commitment to what was once celebrated by their fellow Europeans as humanistic culture. Nor does Zionism, which reestablishes a circumscribed, and one may even say circumcised, Jewish social space. I love this C, anyway, forgive me for the... Nor does Zionism, which establishes a circumscribed Jewish social space secured not only by political sovereignty, but also by the renewal of Hebrew as the regnant vernacular of the country, seek to curtail the Jews' multicultural affiliations. In this respect, Zionism is consciously post-traditional. From the very outset, cultural Zionists understood their task as forging a cultural discourse that would, in the words of Martin Buber, acknowledge the fact that modern Jews dwell in multiple cultures. And I quote from Buber, "We Jews need to be conscious of the fact that we are a cultural admixture in a more poignant sense than any other people." But Buber hastens to add, "We do not, however, wish to be slaves to this admixture, but its masters." From a theoretical perspective, the challenge posed by Buber could be formulated as the determination of a mode of cultural discourse that will allow Jews to honor their bewildering and chaotic assemblage of ever multiplying and subtracting identities while providing a measure of Jewish continuity. Such a mode of discourse is elucidated, I believe, by the concept of cultural memory proposed by contemporary German scholars Aleida and Jan Assmann. They are a married couple, of course. Cultural, not of course, but they're a husband and wife, both scholars who have worked on these issues and have developed this concept I like to explore with you now, cultural memory. Cultural memory, as they conceive of it, is a form of knowledge accumulated across the generations, specific to a particular group, and by means of which the group bases its consciousness of its unity and specificity. In other words, its self-image and identity. Cultural memory has its point of departure or origin in fateful events in the past, historically or otherwise conceived, memory of which is maintained for a variety of mnemonic activities that constitute the cultural life specific to that group. Aleida and Jan Assmann emphasize that these mnemonic expressions are not confined to the written word, but also have musical, pictorial, and ritual forms. Hence, cultural memory is embodied in art, architecture, buildings, ceremonies, historic and sacred landscapes, law, folklore, literature, music, collective narratives, philosophy, poetry, rituals, songs, symbols, theology, etc. What is crucial is that all these mnemonic expressions have a canonical or semi-canonical status in a specific society and thus serve to stabilize its cultural identity across the generations. Creating memory spaces within the context of everyday life, these activities and gestures constitutes, and I quote, islands of transcendent time, and thus are also the focus of the structures of meaning, values, and norms that determine the conduct and self-understanding of the group. The Assmanns highlight two moments characteristic of cultural memory that are especially significant for our discussion. The first is that the primary impulse that draws members of a particular group to its cultural memory is not a general theoretical curiosity, as would appertain to a university, the world of science, to acquire knowledge, but the desire to belong, the need for identity. Second, although canonical knowledge, cultural memory is constantly being reconstructed, reread in the light of present circumstances and perceptions. Cultural memory is thus not a simple retrieval of knowledge as in a cybernetic system stored in the collective archives of a culture. It is rather the recontextualization of that knowledge, or if you wish, the contemporalization of the past, rendering the past contemporary. As contemporized past and recontextualized knowledge, cultural memory is, in fact, a process one that is governed by given modes of response. These modes reflect varying attitudes and ideological postures toward the present and other cultures and systems of knowledge. That wasn't so clear. I'm going to read that again, assuming you're following me. These modes reflect these modes of response to our cultural memory, or modes of interaction with our cultural memory, reflect varying attitudes and ideological postures towards the present and other cultures and systems of knowledge. Following the Asmans, we may delineate three essential modes of how the bearers of a cultural memory encounter and accommodate new configurations of reality, experiences, information, and sources of knowledge and meaning. One is a rigidly conservative posture that seeks to ensure the preeminence of the inherited cultural memory by veiling it, the cultural memory, in dogmatic garments, resisting all that might threaten its integrity. A second posture is that which, while still basically defensive, employs a hermeneutic strategy allowing for a constructive response to contemporary reality. This mode of response fosters a dialectic ebb and flow between innovation and continuity. Yet, when confronting fundamentally different systems of knowledge, this position invariably falls prey to dogmatic self-enclosure. A third mode of cultural memory is guided by a self-reflective posture, promoting a critical awareness of the culture's presuppositions, prejudices, and blind spots, as it were. Most significantly, this mode of cultural memory acknowledges the polyphonic character of its own evolution. By assuming a tolerant attitude towards the plural voices within their own tradition, the guardians of cultural memory are implicitly aware that no culture is utterly insular and untouched by other alien cultures. Indeed, as the Palestinian scholar Edward Said has noted, virtually all cultures, certainly so-called high cultures, evolve in interaction with other cultures. And I quote from, may I say, our Palestinian brother, Edward Said, far from being unitary or monolithic or autonomous things, cultures actually assume more foreign elements, alterities, differences than they consciously exclude. End of quote. Clearly, I, Paul Mendes-Flohr, favor the self-reflective critical mode of cultural memory. I favor it precisely because it is undogmatic, pluralistic, and open. In order to support the type of multicultural sensibility that I unapologetically celebrate, it would have to be augmented by a determination to minimize the othering that any affirmative assumption of a cultural and thus political identity inevitably entails. The vectors of identity are many. It projects a society's self-image, but it also perforce defines social boundaries, excluding the other who stands beyond those boundaries, both cognitively and socially. Self-image bears in its breast an image of the non-self. This is an antinomy, an irresolvable paradox faced by all those who are bound to a particular cultural memory, whose compassion and humanity also alert them to the dangers of self-insularity and exclusion. A critical multicultural identity at least modifies those dangers. Accordingly, I venture to conjecture that the God of Israel, who, as the prophet Amos reminds us, is also the God of the Ethiopians, that is of all humanity, blesses our efforts to foster plural and multicultural identities. I should like to conclude with a story that I believe illustrates the dialectical contours of cultural memory. It's a tale told to me by a colleague and friend, Wendy Doniger, whose marvelous book, Other People's Myths, I mentioned in the previous lecture. Once, when Wendy went on vacation, her cleaning lady sought, as one would say in biblical Hebrew, to find favor in Wendy's eyes. Eager to please Wendy, she took it upon herself to rearrange Wendy's vast library according to color and size. All the red-covered books were placed together, and so it was with the green-covered and the purple and the yellow books. The multicolored tomes were organized according to size. Those standing 10 inches high were placed together, and so on. Much to the poor cleaning lady's bewildered disappointment, Wendy was not particularly delighted by her efforts. The organization of our libraries are indeed crucial and tell much about our spiritual and intellectual universe. Walter Benjamin, the great German Jewish writer, observed this when, after moving to a new flat apartment, he unpacked his library from the huge crates he shipped them in. In unpacking his library, the books were in the reverse order in which they were placed into the crates, and thereby assumed an utterly different spiritual constellation, or if one wishes, construction of one's cultural memory. Indeed, cultural memory has much to do with how we organize our libraries, our spiritual universe. Books are often acquired in a random fashion, with no discernible logic. And as moderns, our books are assembled from numerous and often widely divergent cultures and intellectual disciplines. The German Jewish businessman and patron of the arts, Zalman Shokin, was said to have one of the finest personal libraries in Europe. He could afford it, of course. At one point in his life, he developed a passionate interest in Jewish matters and acquired a priceless collection of Judaica. But he insisted in mingling his Jewish books among his other books. Alongside the collected works of Goethe, he would perhaps have had a set of Maimonides' writings. Schiller would be straddled by Stroum Lecture and the Hasidic tales of Buber. He deliberately and demonstratively organized his library as a syncretistic scheme, or as my late father would say, a mishmash of Jewish, German, French, Italian, ancient, and modern writings. Shokin's contemporary, Franz Rosenzweig, organized his library according to another principle. The Jewish philosopher fastidiously kept his Jewish books apart from the other works that filled his impressive list. He would object to Shokin's placement of Jewish books, particularly those of a sacred nature, within the syncretistic world of his library. Mind you, Jewish writings occupied in Rosenzweig's library separate shelves and were not withdrawn into a separate room, where they would, in effect, constitute an autonomous library. They, the Jewish sacred writings, would, so to speak, stand over and against the other writings in dialogue. Mounted on separate shelves, they would maintain their distinctive, transcendent voice as they engaged the other thought systems inscribed in the other volumes in Rosenzweig's commanding library. Indeed, what Rosenzweig sought was a dialogue between his Jewish self, grounded in the sacred reality of the divine covenant, and his worldly universe of culture, buttressed, as it were, primarily by German literature and ancient classics. The next lecture will be devoted to exploring two alternative but complementary strategies for constituting a post-traditional Jewish library and cultural memory. Thank you.
Would you agree that the phrase self-hating Jew, which we so often hear, tells you more about the one who uses it than the person to whom it's directed?
Rob, I guess you all heard his question. The term self-hating Jew was coined by Jews, of course, actually we know who, a man named Theodor Lessing, to describe what he regarded as a pathological condition of some Jews, and one must not totally dismiss it. There were Jews who were shamed by their Jewish identity. Most famous case is Otto Weiniger, a very gifted young man who in many ways preceded Freud and insights we now call psychoanalysis. But Weiniger also felt that the Jew in him, the Jew in everyone, was a corrupting force. And to free himself in the world of this disease he carried in him as a genetic curse, he committed suicide at the age of 24. And there are many other instances of, so not necessarily so extreme, but there is a validity to discussing or to using the term, especially for Jews who have been shown of a positive understanding of themselves. We must remember the Jews entered the modern world, they encountered many negative images of Judaism. Even the great proponents of Jewish emancipation, integration of the Jews in this modern culture, often had extraordinarily derisive, derogatory things to say about Judaism. And of course, we know that the more nasty conceptions of the Jews, from their physiognomy to their behavior to body odor, etc. But if you just think about a Jew has lost any sense of positive image, entering a house of mirrors, and all he sees in that house of mirrors is the distorted images of himself, he would be horrified. That's me. And that often happens when we don't have access to a positive image of ourselves. Now, it could be often polemically misused. Anyone who has quizzical, a questioning position. I assume there may be even those who would regard my own exposition of what it means to be a modern Jew to be an expression of self-hatred. Certainly, if you heard my political views about the state of Israel, and I'm an Israeli, a proud Israeli, but I have many very, very critical views. Some in Israel would regard me as a self-hating Israeli. And that, of course, is a polemical accusation that has little value. So we must make a distinction between the terms more specific, historical, sociological, psychological use, and its misuse.
Are you willing to take one more question, Professor?
Yeah, please, certainly.
In a point that you made in passing that Jews were not the originators of modernity, but found a welcome place within modernity. I thought you passed over that somewhat quickly because I think while I would agree with you that the Enlightenment was not a product of Jewish thinking and Jews found a welcome place within it, there's one aspect of modernity that I think Jews might be credited in a positive way of creating, and that's the post-Darwinian kind of prophetic view of the ability to overcome the biological represented in Marx, Lahavdil, and Freud, one of quite a self-hating Jew, but one a very identified Jew. They were responsible of creating a kind of modernity of the late 19th and 20th century that was a different kind of modernity that really seems to have more of a Jewish character to it. And I just wanted to know if you
Your
might
name, sir?
comment on that.
Your name?
Jim Morrell.
Okay, Paul. I don't know if that's necessary, but there's a mic here that may help amplify my voice. I'm not fleeing you or the question, I'm just retreating to the mic, Jim. There are Jewish thinkers who sought to suggest that Jews have a particular affinity as Jews, not just as individuals who enter the modern world, but spiritually, intellectually, affinity with aspects of modernity. The philosopher Hermann Cohen was, of course, a great philosopher in his own right, but also devoted great in his own right as an academic philosopher, and also devoted a great deal of thought to Jewish issues, claimed that the prophetic spirit of Israel had a particular affinity to the liberal democratic aspects of modernity, not its economic and political order, but its democratic liberal ethos. And that is that we are responsible for the other, especially those who are steeped in, those who are agonized by poverty, those who are disinherited for a variety of social prejudices. As the children of Amos, B'nai Amos, Anachnu, or Anu, we are the children of Amos, the prophet. We are responsible for the other. And he felt this was a distinctive contribution of the Jews to the modern spirit of what we would call the liberal ethos. Whether that constitutes the charge that the Jews created the modern world is, of course, of a very different, of a different category or a different argument.
You spoke a bit about the difficulty that Zionism has in, or contemporary Israeli culture has in mediating modernity and and the break with tradition. And
Right.
I'm interested in your assessment of the attempts to mediate modernity within the liberalizing religious movements, and how you assess that in the context of, or along with Zionism.
I've written on it, but I'm perhaps in the book that I will be preparing on the basis of these lectures, I'll have a chapter devoted to that. But let me just perhaps quickly indicate the problematic with an anecdote and then a brief explanation. Many years ago, when Israeli TV took off, we were dependent on imports from abroad, and particularly America. And one particular series we had was Wonder Woman, which was translated in Hebrew as Eshet Chayil. Eshet Chayil, which of course refers to the valorous wife and mother of a Jewish family. But Wonder Woman was translated as Eshet Chayil, and was shown on a Saturday afternoon. Religious Jews heard that there's a program on Eshet Chayil. We should be able to enjoy it as well. So they demanded of Israeli TV to shift the hour in which the Wonder Woman was broadcast from Shabbat afternoon to Motzei Shabbat, to after the Sabbath. And the secular Jews in Israeli TV said, fine, we'll do that. And suddenly Eshet Chayil appeared, and of course in these brief... Now, there's clearly a problem here of translating religious categories into secular ones. Something was lost in translation.